Oglala Sioux tribe. The word Oglala means the scattered people. The scattered people. The language we speak is Lakota. And I just want to give you a couple of phrases in Lakota. First one is Hihane Washde. Hihane Washde, and that means good morning, because it's still morning where I am. Another one is Hau Mutakiepi. Hau Mutakiepi, and that means hello, relatives. Hello, relatives. I consider you all to be my relatives. Lakota people, and I think this applies across tribes, consider all things to be related. All of creation is related, connected in some way. There is nothing, no one and nothing that is not a part of the circle of relationship. So we're all in there along with animals and reptiles, insects, plants, microorganisms, even things that typically are not seen as living, like rocks, that sort of thing. The planets out there in the sky, in the universe, the moon and the sun, are living to us. There is life within them, life given by the Creator, and that life connects us to everything. That's a big priority for us. We see all that is as our relatives. And some of you, maybe you've been thinking that way and living that way up to this point in your life, but if you haven't seen things that way, if that hasn't been your worldview, think of how it would change your world if you did start seeing things that way. Looking at the earth, this planet, not as a possession to be used or exploited, but as a relative. And that you are called upon to treat the earth as your relative. That's our worldview. That's where we're coming from. My presentation is called "It Ain't Easy Being Native," and as you listen to it, I hope that you will have an open mind, and it's okay to not necessarily agree with some of the things that I say or take issue with them. I'm perfectly fine with that. You can disagree with some things completely if you want to. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or save them for the end of the presentation, and I will address them at that point. I found the hard way that if I start taking questions during the course of my presentation, it delays things and I end up not having enough time to finish at the end. So please save it for the end if you have questions or comments of any kind. I also, just so that you know, I have a dog in the house, a boxer, a 1-year-old boxer. 1-year-old, but weighs about 90 pounds already. She's gigantic. She's still a puppy at heart and doesn't understand that she's got a huge body and a very loud bark. So if you hear that, that's Izzy, my boxer dog, in the house somewhere, hopefully saying amen to the things that I'm saying. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen. Okay, can you see that? How does that look, Aisha? Okay, and you can hear me? Wonderful. It ain't easy being Native, Indigenous people, Christianity, and the Episcopal Church. If you take a look at those images that are on the first slide there, the one at the top, that is the flag of the Oglala Lakota Oyate, or the Oglala Sioux tribe. There's a circle of teepees in the center. The circle is the predominant and most revered symbol to Indigenous people, as opposed to the square or the rectangle or triangle. Circles are found everywhere in Indigenous communities, in the architecture, in the artwork. If there are are groups of Indigenous people who are meeting, if at all possible. People sit in a circle. It represents, as I said, relationship, the connectedness of all things. It also represents a unity of all things and eternity. So relationship, unity, and eternity. And the teepees that are in there, the white teepees, each one of them represents one of the geographical districts of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is my reservation. And at the bottom, there is a document. It's called a papal bull or a papal decree. That's an edict or decree that's issued out of the office of the Pope. And that has to do with the Doctrine of Discovery. And we will take a look at that later. What I'd like to do is say a prayer. And I'll ask that you all stay on mute. Please stay on mute, otherwise there'll be a cacophony of noises and we won't be able to understand what anybody is saying. So I won't be on mute, so I will pray the prayer. It's called the Gathering Prayer. It's taken from a disciple's prayer book, which was issued out of my offices during a previous missionary. It was before my time, but it was written by Indigenous people. So let us pray. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit, for you are God, now and forever. Amen. When you look at this prayer, some of the words that are in there, they include words that are very important to the Indigenous worldview: creation, circle, related or relationship, and then generosity and compassion, which are two central core values for Indigenous people. And I believe that that applies across tribes, not just my own. It's said that an Indigenous person is by nature spiritual and generous. Those are very important core values, being spiritual and being generous. We don't recognize a dichotomy between material and spiritual. To us, all things are spiritual. There's nothing that is not spiritual. Similarly, we don't have a dichotomy or a separation of church and state. You know, our government is spiritual by nature. And when there are tribal council meetings and other public meetings where government officials are involved, it is routine and expected that they involve prayer or hymn singing or some type of religious ceremony that's inherent within them. And generosity, it's all about sharing and doing what we can to help the whole community and not focusing on ourselves as individuals and what we can have and what we can do. We're very much a communal society that believes in sharing what we have, and being generous is seen as a priority to us. So it's said that if a person is not spiritual and a person is not generous, then they're not Indigenous, regardless of their DNA, their background. Now, I use the word Indigenous, and I do that because it's the United Nations understanding of it. Right now, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is happening. It's virtual, and I'll be participating in it along with 10 other Indigenous people within my constituency. And the United Nations has a definition, and here it is: communities, peoples, and nations which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. In other words, colonization. Indigenous people have been colonized by other nations. That's important, that's necessary to the United Nations understanding of indigenous, a people who have been colonized. And there are indigenous people all over the world that fit this definition. The indigenous people of this continent, for example, American Indians or Native Americans certainly are. But in other continents as well. Europe has indigenous people. The Sami, sometimes called the Laplanders, in extreme North Scandinavia by the Arctic Circle, are considered indigenous. And they're not Episcopalian, but if they were, they would fall under the auspices of my office, even though they are very much Caucasian in race. Now, what's the best way to refer to an indigenous person? You know, indigenous is kind of an anthropological, governmental term, but it is acceptable. But the ideal way is, if you know the tribe of the person, to refer to them by that. So I would be referred to as an Oglala Sioux, or even the language that is spoken by the Oglala Sioux, the Lakota. Other tribes that speak Lakota, besides mine, would be considered Lakota collectively. And if you're able to know the clan or family that the person is from, that's even better. So you can describe the person can describe him or herself as their tribal identity, and then their clan identity and family identity. For me, my clan is the clan of Makpialuta, or Red Cloud. Red Cloud is a distant ancestor of mine on my mother's side, Makpialuta. And my family's been anglicized for a long time. So we don't have indigenous names. The most recent family name that I'm aware of from the late 19th century is Wambli Tashunka. Wambli Tashunka, or Eagle Horse. Eagle Horse is the last family name that my people have. And then we were anglicized after that. We took European surnames. And my surname is German. But interestingly enough, I have very little German in me. I took one of those DNA tests, the 23andMe recently, and I thought there'd be a substantial amount of German in there. There was very little German. I'm mostly indigenous, Native American, and then a weird combination of Western European mutt. I'm not really sure what my European ancestors were up to. Now, some people use the term Native American, and sometimes they use the term American Indian or just Indian. And what I can tell you is that we're fine being referred to as Indians. We have no problem with that at all. It's not an offensive term. So we will do that. We will refer to each other as Indians, or sometimes abbreviated NDN. NDN. We will refer to each other as that. Native American and American Indian, not so much. There are a number of us who don't like those terms because they have the word America in them. And because of colonization in our history, a lot of us have a problem with that word being used in identifying us. So we're okay with Indian, not so much those other two. Now, before 1492, the area now known as the United States was populated by indigenous people of many nations and tribes with their own languages, social customs, and spiritual expressions. The indigenous population in 1492 is estimated to have been at least 10 million. Some suggest 50 million or more. We don't know. The reality is we don't know. But what anthropologists do is they take a look at what the estimated population was on other continents at that time, and they infer that it was the same or just about the same here in the Western Hemisphere. And so the indigenous population in what is now known as the United States in 1492 is estimated to have been at least 10 million people. There are some who suggest 50 million or more. And that's just the area now known as the United States. That doesn't include Canada, for example, and they had First Nations people there, of course. What we do know is that about 400 years later, in 1890, there was a census, and the US indigenous population was recorded at 249,000 at that time. So it went from at least 10 million to 249,000 400 years later. Under ordinary circumstances, that population should have at least doubled in those 400 years. Europe's population tripled during that same time frame, and they had plagues at that time and wars. And it still grew as a population ordinarily would. It was nearly rubbed out completely, the indigenous population in this region. That is what genocide looks like statistically. There we go. Genocide happened right here in our own backyard. I think most, if not all of us, are aware of that. We don't like to think about it. A lot of people deny it or try to minimize it or dismiss it, but it happened right here, and it was intentionally and systematically implemented from 1492 to 1890. I use the year 1890 because that's the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre that occurred in South Dakota. Now, my understanding of genocide is to make a people disappear. Making a people disappear. There are different methods of doing that, and they were all perpetrated initially by European invaders in North America and the Western Hemisphere, and they were continued by governments, including the United States government and churches, through assimilation processes, namely the residential schools or the boarding schools for Indian children. When we think of genocide here in the United States, we often think of it as being perpetrated by evil dictators in other countries, bad guys, and usually they lose power or are no longer in power over time. And we don't think about it when we look at our own leadership historically. But it did occur here, and it was committed by a government that is still in power today, and by guys who are seen as the good guys, our founding fathers and American heroes. One perpetrator of genocide, who in my opinion was just barbaric, was Andrew Jackson, the architect of the Trail of Tears. And he's on the $20 bill right now. So every time an indigenous person looks at a $20 bill, they look at someone who basically is our equivalent of Hitler. And a lot of people don't understand that, but that really is our experience. Now, let's go back farther than Andrew Jackson. This is, as I said, a papal bull, a decree issued out of the Pope's office. This is a more recent one. This one isn't ancient. This one was issued whenever the last Pope, named Pius, was in office. I'm not sure when that was. But you see the thing hanging from the bottom of the paper there? That's the seal of the Bishop of Rome. And the term for that is a bulla. That's a bulla. So that's where we get the term papal bull from. The Doctrine of Discovery was a series of these things, these papal bulls. There's no one document that's called the Doctrine of Discovery. It's basically three papal bulls or decrees that were issued. The first one would be the Dum Diversas, issued in 1452, and then the Romanus Pontifex, issued in 1454, a couple of years later. They were issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Afonso V of Portugal, confirming to the Crown of Portugal dominion over lands in Africa. Along with encouraging the seizure of the lands of Saracen Turks and non-Christians, they granted permission for the enslavement of such peoples. So these two papal decrees gave the Pope's blessing and encouragement to a European nation, namely Portugal this time, to take land as their own and to put the people there in subjugation as slaves. So these two documents laid the foundation for slavery of African people, eventually extending over to the Western Hemisphere as well. So the slavery of African people had its roots in the church. That's where it came from. The purpose of it was considered to be indoctrination, making Christian, non-Christian peoples, but it went far beyond that. It involved the taking of land and the taking of human life and the use of it. Here's a quote from the Dum Diversus. This is the Pope. "We grant you by these present documents with our apostolic authority full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude." There's more to the document than that, of course, but that's a quote from it. Then, a year after Columbus, the Inter Cetera was issued by Pope Alexander VI, in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects. This was the first use of that term, discovery or discovered. And this decree asserted the rights of Spain and Portugal to do the same in Africa, to convert and enslave discovered Africans. So these three documents comprise what is known as the Doctrine of Discovery, because they contain within them the rights of Christian European nations to colonize, to take land and have dominion over indigenous people in Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Here's an artist's depiction of Columbus's discovering probably the island of Hispaniola or someplace in the Caribbean when he landed. A few years later, a patent was granted by King Henry VII to John Cabot and his sons. King Henry VII had heard about this doctrine of discovery, and by this patent, he indicated his official royal support for Cabot's enterprise. As an agent of the English crown, Cabot was empowered to investigate, claim, and possess lands which before this time were unknown to all Christians, which meant he could not intrude on Spanish and Portuguese discoveries. The king would receive 1/5 of the value of merchandise brought back to Bristol, though he had invested no money of his own. So it became about business and the making of money and power, and not really religion, although that's where all of this started. The Jamestown colony was founded in 1607. That was the first Anglican colony in what is now your Commonwealth of Virginia. I think it's in the Diocese of Southern Virginia. I've been there a couple of times. And we all know the story of Pocahontas. It's been romanticized significantly over the years. Indigenous people really see the Pocahontas story as not a romantic story or in a positive light, but really actually as a nightmare, Here you have a young Indigenous woman, her name was Matoaka, and her father, Powhatan, encounters these English people who were settling in the area, attempting to colonize, and they were operating according to the original charter of King James, which called for the colonization of that region. And for the people to have dominion over it. And so she is married to a man named John Rolfe, and even though the story says it was a love story, a beautiful falling in love, we don't know that that's necessarily the case. What we do know is that she was taken away from her home and went to England to live, where she died. And her tomb is still there today. She didn't get a chance to come home. And we know, Indigenous people know that from our perspective, that's the worst thing that can possibly happen to a person. To be removed from their people and not see home again. It's a fate worse than death. It's a fate worse than death, because at least when a person dies, they get to go be with the ancestors and they're not alone. But as long as they're alive, if they're away from their home and away from their people, they are alone. And that's, as I said, the worst thing. So we see the Pocahontas story differently. So this doctrine of discovery, which started in the office of the Pope and then went to Portugal and then Spain and then England, finds its way over here to what is now known the United States. In 1792, Thomas Jefferson declared that the discovery philosophy would extend from Europe to the infant US government. The doctrine and its legacy began to influence American imperialism and the treatment of indigenous peoples. That's found in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which I highly recommend that you read if you haven't read it before. That book will put shockwaves through your system, because it challenges probably most of what you've learned earlier in your life with regard to United States history. So now the discovery doctrine or philosophy is here in the United States by one of our founders and the writer of the Declaration of Independence. And if you've read the Declaration of Independence and remember what you read in there, you might recall that Jefferson referred to the indigenous people of the New World as merciless Indian savages who would be specifically excluded from the principles of freedom and human rights declared in the document. So in other words, the document did not pertain to the merciless Indian savages. And the Supreme Court was influenced by it, namely Johnson versus McIntosh, if you recall that ruling from history in the 19th century. The doctrine of discovery was specifically used conceptually in the debate of that case. Chief Justice John Marshall said that the right of discovery was well illustrated by the royal commission that England's King Henry VII gave to John Cabot and his sons. That commission instructed the Cabots to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, and provinces of the heathens and infidels that before this time have been unknown to all Christian people. The United States Supreme Court called this claim a right of domination. And essentially what it said, what Johnson versus McIntosh said was that indigenous people do not have rights to their land. They do not have rights to their land. Now, interestingly enough, Marshall flip-flopped on that. He changed his mind in the Supreme Court ruling several years later, Worcester versus Georgia. And he ruled, or the Supreme Court ruled, that the United States government must relate to indigenous tribes as sovereign nations. But it was a very hollow victory, and not really a victory at all for indigenous people, because Andrew Jackson, the president at that time, refused to support or enforce this decision. There's a quote attributed to him in which Jackson said, "The Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So it was never enforced. And the trail of tears followed, the forcible removal of a number of Southern tribes from their land, forcible deportation to Oklahoma, a journey on which many of them died. along the way, men, women, and children. Now, you might recall the phrase manifest destiny from history. That was a phrase that was originated by a newspaper editor, John O'Sullivan, and it expressed the philosophy that drove 19th century US territorial expansion. So manifest destiny, I see that as the American narrative of the doctrine of discovery. The American narrative of it. It held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Here's a painting by the artist John Gast from 1872. It's called American Progress. And it was seen as a good thing. Civilization being brought to America from the east going to the west. And you can see the contrasts in the sky, and you can see people being driven out, indigenous people being driven out. You can see bison or buffalo in the distance being driven away, and the descendants of Europeans moving in. You see the stagecoach, you see the trains, you see ships on the river, and Lady Liberty or Columbia in the center, holding a book that looks like some type of authoritative book. Maybe it's the Bible, I'm not sure. And a spool of telegraph wire bringing progress to the New World. American Progress by John Gast. If you've ever visited the Capitol buildings of numerous states and commonwealths, it's not unusual to see this genre of art on the walls there. A manifest destiny influenced art coming from the 19th century. I've been in several state capitals, and there's always some type of representation of that. Well, there was a problem with this American progress. Indigenous people were there, occupying land, getting in the way, resisting the progress. And so that's when the genocidal practices began to be implemented by the United States government. And there were two ways of doing it that were employed. The first one was just outright killing people, just annihilating them. And that happened. We don't know how many people were killed, murdered in this way. But we do know of a number of massacres that took place. This is an artist named Oscar Howe. He's a Lakota or Oglala Sioux artist, Oscar Howe. This is his painting of Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 that I mentioned earlier, where the 7th Cavalry shot and killed an unknown number of people. I've heard it estimated as at least 250 and maybe as high as 400. We don't really know. We just know that most of them were buried in a mass grave a short time later, and the grave is still there at Wounded Knee. And the soldiers who committed the massacre were given medals of honor for what they did. There's been some efforts to rescind those medals of honor in recent years. I don't know that they've been completely successful, however. So that was one method, just killing people and getting rid of them. But there was a problem with that. There was a problem with that. And I'm not talking about a moral problem that people had. It was a financial problem. It was expensive to do. It costs a lot of money to get rid of people, I guess. So they had to find a cheaper means. And that was through the residential school or the boarding school, forcibly assimilating indigenous children into the dominant society of the general population of America. So they were taken or sent to boarding schools throughout the country during the late 19th century. This is a photograph of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School student body. The school was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's known as the flagship boarding school. And its superintendent was Captain Richard Henry Pratt. And Richard Henry Pratt had a motto that the school lived by, and his motto was, "Kill the Indian in order to save the man." Kill the Indian in order to save the man. So get rid of whatever indigenous or Indian qualities there would be in a person and replace them with the language and the culture of the dominant American society in order that they may have a chance of succeeding in the new world. You know, it was seen as a positive thing, a good thing, a way of helping these indigenous children out by giving them a chance at success, but also making the Indian in them disappear so that it was no longer a problem. So as you can see, these children in various ages wearing uniform clothing, the boys with their hair cut. And I've looked at this photo many, many times, and I tell you, I can't see a single face that shows any sense of happiness or peace. I see looks of despair, looks of fear, looks of depression, and understandably so. Some of these children were taken from their families in places as far away as Alaska and sent to Pennsylvania and didn't get a chance to go back home until later on in their life, if at all. Some of them died there at Carlisle. I took these pictures a number of years ago. The site is still there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That's near Gettysburg and Harrisburg. It's an Army War College now. And all that's left of the boarding school is the Indian cemetery, where the remains of indigenous children who died while at Carlisle are buried. They did not get a chance to go home. They never saw home again. And that's the cemetery, looking very much like a military cemetery. And you can see the names of the indigenous children and their tribal affiliation, if it were known. And unfortunately and sadly, some of these tombstones just say unknown. The identity of that child is not known. And I have no way of knowing how any of them died. I just know that they didn't get a chance to go back home, except there have been a number of cases in which the remains of these children have been taken home for a proper burial. That happened recently, a couple of years ago, where 3 Oneida tribe girls who died at Carlisle and were buried in the cemetery had their remains exhumed, and they were sent back to the Oneida Reservation to be buried there. And their funeral was at Holy Apostles Episcopal Church in Oneida. I went to the funeral. It was very moving. And one of the girls was buried in the church cemetery, and then the other 2 were buried in the tribal cemetery. So they were able to go home finally, but most of them have not been able to. Here's a photograph showing the transition of what happened at a boarding school. On the left is the before picture, and on the right is after they've been there for a while. This is really sad when I take a look at it, because there's some people who would have seen that as progress, but it must have destroyed these boys in a number of ways. When you take a look at them on the left, take a look at the clothing that they're wearing, their long hair and their feathers. A couple of them have black-tipped eagle feathers in their hair. The hair was seen as the the physical manifestation of the soul. And so the longer your hair was, the wiser you were. And indigenous people didn't cut their hair unless they were in distress or mourning. It was seen as a negative thing. The clothing they're wearing tells the story of their life up to that point. It indicates rites of passage. It's essentially like wearing a name tag, except having everything that you want somebody to know about you on that tag. So you can infer a number of things from these boys just by looking at them. The black-tipped eagle feather, for example, meant that you had become a man. You had become an adult. And you were ready to start your own family. Well, they were sent to Carlisle. Their hair was cut. Their clothes were taken away from them. Their feathers were taken away. The two young men were made boys again, and they had to start over from scratch to learn how to be Americans. I can't think of a more devastating experience that anybody could have, especially at that age. It had to have been horrific. I don't know how they got through it. I really don't. Both of my parents went to boarding schools. My father was raised in the boarding school at Pine Ridge, the Oglala Community School, from age 5 to age 18. He lived at that school. My mother went to St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian girls in Springfield, South Dakota. That was a church-run Episcopal boarding school for female Indian children. That's a photograph at the top of, at the very top, you can see that's St. Mary's. It no longer exists, but that's what it looked like at the time. My mother was there in the 1930s and early 40s. And down at the underneath that photo are two photos of my dad. My dad is in the center there of that photo with his two brothers. That was taken on a happy occasion. That was one of the times when he could go home to see his parents. That didn't happen very often because they lived at the school during the school year. And then during the summer, usually the children were farmed out to local farmers to do work. And it was seen as an educational experience, an opportunity for them to learn the trade of farming, or that's how they looked at it anyway at the school. But it was actually a lot of hard work. And they had to be away from their families at that time. So that was very difficult. There's my dad on the right. That photograph was taken when he was 17, I think, 16 or 17. And I look at his face in that photo, and I know that not only was he living in the boarding school, but his mother probably had just died or was dying at that time. She had serious heart problems. She had rheumatic fever when she was a child. And so she died when he was 16 or 17. I can't remember. I look at his face in that photo and I can see that he's really, really struggling to get by. He told me that when he was taken to the boarding school at age 5, just 5 years old, and nothing was explained to him about what was happening. He was just taken there. And he said every evening after supper, he would go down to the front gate of the school, he said, and I would wait. I would just stand there and wait for someone to come and take me home, is what he said. Every evening for about a year. And then after that year passed, he realized that the person he was waiting for wasn't coming. And he cried. He grieved. But the school was not a place where you could show emotions like that. You couldn't show sorrow. You couldn't cry because you get beaten up and made fun of if you did. And so he learned to suppress his emotions and got to be pretty good at that. And then he got angry. He got angry. and then realized that he had to be tough or he wasn't going to survive what he was going through. So he did. And he did survive. I'm gonna, oops. So what does the boarding school experience, the assimilation experience, do for Indigenous people? Well, I think it results in significant identity confusion and internal conflict. The question of who am I as an Indigenous person living in America in the 21st century is a very complex question to contend with. There are some who would say that it's not possible to be authentically Indigenous because of what's happened. I don't know if that's the case or not. I just know that it's something that I've been struggling with my entire life and probably will continue to do so. So much has been lost through the assimilation process. So much of our culture, our language, our values, and our spirituality. So when we try to remember and teach them and pass them on to future generations, we're doing so knowing that there was an interruption of about 2 or 3 generations where all of that was either discouraged or prohibited. Religion, for example, a religious expression. Indigenous people didn't have freedom of religion until 1978. Our traditional ceremonies and spiritual practices were outlawed. They were seen as subversive to the government. And that was not rescinded until 1978. So when we started practicing them again publicly, we did so with a 2 or 3 generation interruption. So there's always debate now over what did our ancestors really teach us? What did they really believe? How did they really practice? And in some cases, we don't really know. We're just trying to recreate it as best we can. So this is the reason I think that Indigenous people currently and for decades have had the highest rates of suicide, of domestic violence and abuse, and of substance abuse and homicide. In proportion to the population, I believe we have the highest of all of those. And I can't help but suspect that this is directly related to the multi-generational or intergenerational trauma that we have experienced historically. And there's been some research done, epigenetic research, indicating that trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. And I believe it. I believe it. So there's a price to be paid for genocide. Somebody pays it ultimately. And I don't see how you can expect a people whose ancestors have experienced genocide to just get over it. How do you get over genocide? I don't know. I don't think you can. And I know that there is a price to be paid for it. Well, we're coming back. We're still here. The current Indigenous population in the United States is over 6 million, with over 570 tribes. And those are just the tribes that have been federally recognized by the United States Department of the Interior. It is a cruel irony, a very cruel irony, I think, that in order to be seen legally as a legitimate tribe, a tribe has to be recognized as such by the same government that tried to wipe it out. We have to meet their criteria. And it's the government that has established the criteria by which a person can become a member of a tribe. It's not coming from the tribe itself. It's established according to government or Department of the Interior standards. And they're the ones who introduced the blood quantum requirement, or the percentage of Indian blood that a person needs to have in order to be enrolled in the tribe. Blood quantum, the problem with that is that it naturally is reduced over generations. Unless you marry somebody who is in your same tribe and have children with that person, you're going to lose your percentage in subsequent generations. It's going to keep going down to the point where you're no longer qualified to be a member of your own tribe, according to the Department of the Interior. I believe that was intentionally done. I believe that was intentionally a subtle way of continuing the genocidal process, of making us disappear. And when you have a reduced number of people who are eligible to be tribal members, eventually the tribe disappears. It loses its status. And we're seeing that happen, sadly. Fortunately, not all tribes require blood quantum. Sometimes it's measured, but the percentages of it can be lowered, can be very low. I was able to establish membership in my tribe by proving that I'm married to my parents, who are also tribal members. That's all I had to do. That's all I had to do, is show my birth certificate and have my parents give a testimony. And the tribe admitted me to enrollment. So, but not all tribes are that easy. Some are very, very difficult. Another thing is that most Indigenous people do not live on reservations or land trusts, but in urban metropolitan areas. According to the recent census, 87% of Indigenous people, 87% live in urban metropolitan areas and not on reservations or land trusts. That's largely because of the effects of the Indian Relocation Act of the 1950s that was implemented under the Eisenhower administration. There was government funding provided for Indigenous people to leave the reservation and move to urban areas where they were given housing and employment. It was another attempt at assimilating Indigenous people. So a number of Indigenous people participated in that program, the Indian Relocation Act. And that's why there's still, in virtually every major metropolitan area in the United States, a community of Indigenous people. Some communities are bigger than others. I believe Los Angeles has the highest concentration of Indigenous people in the United States right now. Population there, last I heard, was over 250,000 Indigenous people in the Los Angeles area. So people may not see us. People may not see us. We may not be obvious, but we're there. We're there where you all live. Every now and then, a bishop will tell me, well, I don't have any Indigenous people in my diocese, unfortunately. Well, that's probably not true. There probably are Indigenous people there. They're just not being seen or recognized, and probably haven't had an association with the Episcopal Church. But I'll bet you anything, they're there. Now, the Church of England and Indigenous people, the first contact that the Church of England had was accidental. It took place on the West Coast in the San Francisco area, the Bay Area, specifically today known as Drake's Bay, where chaplains, Anglican chaplains to Sir Francis Drake, met and interacted with Indigenous people in that region. But the first intentional attempt at establishing a colony with chaplains and churches was at Jamestown for the Anglicans. And then in the Episcopal Church, Bishop John Henry Hobart of New York began the first intentional mission to the Oneida people in the early 1800s. That's when the Oneida were living in New York. Now they're living in Wisconsin. And there was a great deal of mission work that took place in the upper Midwest in the mid 1800s to the late 1800s and early 20th century. I'm Episcopalian. I'm sitting here talking with you right now because of the mission work that was done at that time, through which my family became a Christian and members of the Episcopal Church. Now, you may ask yourself, why would Indigenous people be interested in joining a Christian church in the 19th century? They obviously saw what the church was up to. They saw the church working hand in hand with the government in the assimilation process. So why would an Indigenous person even be interested? Well, there were three reasons. First, I said, as I mentioned earlier, traditional Indigenous ceremonies were illegal. And that proposed a real dilemma for Indigenous people because, as I said, we are inherently spiritual. We are spiritual people. It's not possible to be Indigenous and not be spiritual as well. And we are not privately spiritual either. We talk about our faith, we act it out, we engage in ceremonies. That's just who we are. That's life. That's what life is about to us. So we couldn't not do that anymore. So we had to find a legal, safe way of doing it. And that was by joining a Christian church. Most Indigenous people, almost all of us at that time, joined a church. We had some kind of church affiliation in order to do that. And the second point, out of a necessity to survive, because the churches were very active in helping us out, keeping us from starving to death in some instances, and interceding for us with the government in our favor. One bishop who did quite a bit of that was the first bishop of Minnesota, Henry Benjamin Whipple. Did quite a bit of interceding on behalf of the Ojibwe and Dakota people in his diocese. So Indigenous people were in a very precarious, risky situation if they didn't have a church affiliation in the 19th century. And then the third reason, which I find the most fascinating and the most relevant to today's situation, is that Indigenous people identified with the Christ figure. Indigenous people had stories and traditions and spiritual expressions, many of which involved a Christ figure, one very similar to Jesus of Nazareth. So when they heard the gospel, they got it right away. They knew what it was about. It wasn't the first time they'd heard that sort of thing. Now, they didn't know about Jesus of Nazareth, the first century Palestinian Jew and Jewish Messiah, but they knew about their own Christ figures. And they saw Jesus as embodying their values and being a part of their own story. So that resonated with them instantly. I think that this is the most currently important reason, because the other two are not issues anymore. Our ceremonies are no longer illegal. We're practicing them, and we don't need the church to survive anymore. We can do just fine without the church. But it's that third one, identifying the Christ figure in our own histories and traditions. That is happening today, and the one person who's done an excellent job, I think, of explaining that is Bishop Stephen Charleston. Bishop Stephen Charleston, in his book, The Four Vision Quests of Jesus, The Four Vision Quests of Jesus, explains how you can be authentically Indigenous and authentically Christian and have an understanding of Jesus, the Christ, as your native Messiah who fulfills your native faith, spirituality, and traditions. I encourage you to read that book if you haven't already. The Four Vision Quests of Jesus by Stephen Charleston. It's very easy to find on Amazon or online. So the Episcopal Church really went to work in the late 19th century. Many churches were founded. Here's a photo of a missionary with Dakota Indians around 1897. And we raised up indigenous leadership to serve in the church. That was a priority. One school that was started with the intention of specifically raising up indigenous leadership in the Episcopal Church was the Seabury Divinity School, which was located in Faribault, Minnesota in the mid-1800s. The Seabury Divinity School, that was their objective, was to raise up indigenous leadership in the church. And Seabury later moved to Illinois and merged with Western Theological Seminary, becoming Seabury Western Theological Seminary, and now it's Bexley Seabury in Chicago. That's where I went to seminary. Seabury Western back in the 1980s. Here's a photo of Enimagabo. Enimagabo, the first indigenous Episcopal priest. He was a part of this cohort of indigenous people who were being raised up at the time. He was ordained in 1867, 57 years before Native Americans were made United States citizens. We weren't made citizens until 1924. We were the last group. The first here. Indigenous people have been in this hemisphere for over 30,000 years, and we were the last to be made United States citizens. But so he wasn't a citizen yet, couldn't speak English, and was a member of a tribe that was at war with the United States government. And Bishop Whipple still ordained him to the Episcopal Church as a priest. That's pretty cutting edge stuff for the time. You know, I think he would probably have a real difficult time getting ordained today, depending on his diocese. But he was, and there were a number of others. Paul Mazzacute, David Pendleton Okerhader, were all very influential leaders in the early Episcopal Church, 19th century Episcopal Church. This is a photograph of Harold Stephen Jones, who was the first indigenous bishop in the Episcopal Church. He was Santee Sioux, and he was ordained suffragan bishop of South Dakota in 1972. He also served in Navajo land for a time. Harold Stephen Jones. I knew him personally. He was a wonderful man, and he confirmed me. I got my confirmation cross from him. And here's a photograph of the presiding bishop's, I think, most recent visit to Navajo land. That's at Good Shepherd Church in Fort Defiance, Arizona. You can see the presiding bishop is there, along with Bishop Bailey of Navajo land. And in that front row there are a number of indigenous female Navajo clergy and lay leaders who I think are just wonderful people. Over there to the far left of the screen is Catherine Plummer, who's a priest. She is the widow of Stephen Plummer, who used to be bishop at Navajo land. He has since died. But he was Navajo and was the bishop there for a while. And then over next to Bishop Bailey, over toward the right-hand side, is her daughter, Kathleen Plummer. And she's in charge of that congregation there, Good Shepherd in Fort Defiance. Wonderful person. I talk with her with some frequency as we do work together. You might recognize this as the map of the dioceses and provinces of the Episcopal Church throughout the world. And traditionally, or at least historically, indigenous ministry has taken place in what are called the four principal dioceses of North and South Dakota, Navajo land, and Alaska. I think you all know where Alaska is. Navajo land is that pie chart that's over there in the southwest, including portions of Utah and Arizona and New Mexico. And North and South Dakota, of course, being in the north central part of the state there. And if you don't know where South Dakota is, it's south of North Dakota. Historically, this is where most of the Indigenous ministry has taken place, and General Convention has given block grants to these dioceses in order to fund the ministry. And up to this point, frankly, I don't think ministry could take place in those regions if it weren't for the block grants. But as I said earlier, the population is all over the United States now, not just in those areas. So we really need to find a way to reach out to those folks. And we haven't done much of that up to this point. We're still kind of operating in the old model. The indigenous group in Los Angeles, as I said before, the largest concentration in the country, they have very little money set aside in the Diocese of LA for that population. Very little, hardly any. It's almost negligible. Obviously, things will have to change. And we have a little over 100 active congregations throughout the Episcopal Church, not including special ministries that operate out of other parishes, and groups and satellites that are commonly found. And then my office was created in 1954 by Executive Council. So we've been around since 1954. And the Reverend Vine Deloria Sr. was the first missioner. The title was secretary at that time. He was the father of Vine Deloria Jr., the well-known author and philosopher. Now, the good news is that the Episcopal Church repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in 2009. And many denominations have done so since then. So we've repudiated it. We've acknowledged that the church had a part in starting this ugliness that resulted in tragedy, the effects of which are continuing to be felt today. And we pledged ourselves to doing what we can to respond to those effects. In 2018, General Convention voted to include this repudiation in the church's theological education processes. That was Resolution D11, calling upon my office to teach the doctrine of discovery to as many people as possible in the church, but namely to those involved in the ordination process. So that if you're going to be ordained in the Episcopal Church, you will know about the doctrine of discovery. You'll know about its effects, and you'll know about what our response to it should be. So that's essentially why I'm doing this. And I've been doing a number of these presentations throughout the church since I became missioner in 2017. It never ceases to amaze me that whenever I do these presentations, how many people have never heard of the Doctrine of Discovery? They've never heard of it. And for those who maybe have heard of it, they don't really know what it is. It hasn't been fully explained to them. Usually responses will be, gee, I was never taught this in school, or I never heard this mentioned in church before. And I think there's a reason for that, a very deliberate reason. That's because history gets to be written by the winners. And the narrative that the winners want to be told and taught is going to be their narrative. And the winners don't like to admit to their wrongdoing. So I think that's a big part of the reason that this information has all but been completely hidden from the public. I see by our time that we only have about 15 minutes left for discussions. So I think I'm going to go ahead. I've got some more that I could share, but I think I've shared virtually all that I think is essential to what I want to do today. So I'm going to stop sharing this and see if we can go to any questions. I see the chat has a number of things in it.
There were a couple questions in chat.
Well, how about this, Aisha? Would you be willing to find a couple questions
Sure.
and read them to me, and I'll do my best to respond.
Let's see. Somebody had a question about, the pandemic, 1918 pandemic, and how, if that had any effect on the children dying in those boarding schools.
That's a good question. Thank you for whoever asked that question. I don't know. I don't, and I think there are two reasons I don't know. One is because it was, over 100 years ago, and these boarding schools were not good at keeping records. There are very few boarding school records that exist today, which is sad. And in fact, it's hard sometimes to even prove that some of these schools existed. There's an organization called the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which has been dealing with that. They're trying to find the records of these residential schools and who were the students, and if they died there, why did they die? There are very, very few of them, and that's sad. So I wish I could answer that question, but I really don't have the evidence for it, one way or the other.
So a research project for you, Chris Cameron, who asked that question. Let's see, Marjorie, it says, if one's family is descended from more than one indigenous tribe and the percent of association with any particular tribe has been diluted in a particular person to the point where he or she cannot claim membership in any one tribe, is there still a way to claim some indigenous heritage?
Well, as I said, not all tribes have a universal method of determining eligibility for enrollment. And some are stricter than others. Mine, as I said, wasn't that difficult to do. But it can result in people not being able to have tribal membership if they don't fulfill that criteria. I know of a number of indigenous people who, there's no doubt in my mind they're indigenous, and I may have known their family, or my family knew their family, or they've lived on a reservation for generations, who for whatever reason don't satisfy the enrollment criteria, and so they can't be enrolled. And that's really sad. But it is possible for them to get some benefits depending on, again, what the criteria is. My office has a scholarship fund that's intended for indigenous students, and we don't require tribal enrollment. We just ask that they write a narrative in which they in some way can explain how they are indigenous and who they were related to and how they were raised. And that's what we go on. We go on the person's narrative and not documentation of enrollment. So it is possible. But again, it's a cruel tragedy, as I've said before, that some indigenous people just can't get enrolled because they can't satisfy a criteria that was established by a government and then by their own tribe.
Thank you. Joe Hensley has a question, and it's, can you give any advice on how we respectfully build relationships with local indigenous peoples and nations? Given the history, I am aware that well-meaning white churches may be viewed with some well-deserved suspicion. I'm also interested in knowing more about reparations work.
Thank you. There is a historically based mistrust that indigenous people have with regard to non-indigenous people. And I think from looking at the history, it's understandable why that would be. And so you have to assume that that's going to be there. But it can be addressed and overcome in time. It takes time to build that trust. You have to demonstrate to the tribal people that you're not interested in exploiting them or appropriating their traditions and languages and spirituality. You're not trying to use them in some way. So you have to prove yourself to them. And I found that in the church, when non-Indigenous clergy serve Indigenous communities, it can take years. It can take 10 years, maybe 20 years before that trust is established. Now, one good example of that is John Floberg, who's up in North Dakota. He's on Standing Rock. And he's been there for over 20 years. And the people know him, and they've come to love him, and they trust him, and they see him as one of their own now. But it took that long for that to happen. And then there are some people who just aren't going to. They're just not going to trust you. And whenever, every now and then somebody writes to me and asks me if I can give them an Indigenous inspired liturgy to use in their congregation. Or would I be willing to meet with them and explain Indigenous spirituality or that sort of thing, and Indigenous ceremonies. And that's always uncomfortable for me, because Indigenous people were very sensitive to having our spirituality appropriated by the dominant society, because frankly, it's all we have left. Everything else has been taken. And if somebody thinks that they're interested in Indigenous spirituality so that they can reach a higher point of enlightenment or inspiration or whatever, we're not interested in that. We're not interested in that. We want to protect what's our own, the only thing we have left. I apologize if that comes across as kind of prickly, but I hope you can understand why it is.
Thank you, Brad. I always encourage everyone who comes to speak to us to be very honest, because I think that's important. We don't want to give people false ideas of something that could be. One
example of that, just real quick. I was in Hawaii riding a trolley, and the trolley was being driven by a native Hawaiian man. And somebody on the trolley, someone from America, or someone, from the mainland, somebody who was not Hawaiian, a white person, asked him how to say the word ocean in Hawaiian. What's the word for ocean in Hawaiian? And the man just kind of was quiet for a while and said, that's a good question. And that's all he said. He said nothing more. And I got it. I got what that transaction was about, what that interaction was about. He knew what the word for ocean was, but why should he have to teach somebody? Why should he have to be the teacher for someone just because they're interested? Somebody that he may have seen as a colonist or descendant of a colonist. So he was protecting his language by doing that. Okay, anyway, next one.
Yeah, so I will say as an aside, that we at the Diocese of Virginia are trying to do a better job at creating relationships with our Indigenous brothers and sisters as part of our racial justice work. So just there will be more meetings. We're working with the Diocese of Southern Virginia. Some of our brothers and sisters from Southern Virginia are on today because we are all trying to work on this very important part of racial justice work together. And we want to do it with the right way. And of course, also working with Brad and having conversations with Brad. So just, we're a little slow to the game, but we're on board and we're going to move forward. And so we ask you to think about joining us when we have opportunities like today. Let's see, do the Indigenous populations in the major cities cluster together like Chinatowns or Little Italies, or is the population diffused into the urban population so as to be invisible or undifferentiated?
They certainly had been in neighborhoods, like a particular neighborhood or region. I know that in Chicago, the indigenous population was in the Uptown neighborhood, just north of the Loop on Lake Michigan. Until recently, it's scattered away from there now, is my understanding. I haven't lived there for about 30 years, but it still was in Uptown at the time I was living there, but it's not anymore. And they used to have an American Indian Center and St. Augustine's Episcopal Mission that are not there anymore. So the population has moved out of that area, probably to suburban areas or other parts of the city. Here in the Minneapolis area, it's in Little Earth, a neighborhood called Little Earth, which is south of downtown Minneapolis, where there's about 30 some thousand indigenous people in that region. There's a housing project there where a number of them live. And they're from all over the country, tribes from all over the country, not just the Dakota and Ojibwe reservations here in Minnesota. But you never really see much evidence of, like you would see in a Chinatown or Little Italy or that sort of thing, because the indigenous people, they're living in these areas, and you might see some murals and artwork, that sort of thing. You might see a teepee or a longhouse somewhere. But by and large, we don't own the businesses. We don't own the businesses in those areas. We don't. So that's what you wouldn't see, as you would see in, say, a Chinatown or a Little Italy, or evidence, oh yeah, there's an Italian neighborhood here and you can see the businesses here and the restaurants and that sort of thing. No, that you would not see.
How do you feel about indigenous acknowledgement statements, which are becoming more common? Any suggestions on how churches might use those?
Yes, I highly recommend a land acknowledgement if you haven't been doing them yet. A land acknowledgement is a statement. It's a published or public statement that's made that acknowledges the tribe that used to live on the land that you now occupy, or the land on which the church building is built, or the diocese. Acknowledging that they were there, it was their home, and so you mention the name of the tribe. So you'll have to research that and see what the name of the tribe was, or tribes, plural. And then you acknowledge that the land was taken from them, or they were forced off the land, whatever happened to them. And you give thanks to them, you give them honor. You say that you honor them. You express regret or remorse for what happened, and a desire to work for peace, justice, and reconciliation with indigenous people throughout the world. There's no universal template for that, but that's basically what it says. And then this is this could be on your diocesan or parish website. It could be in your bulletin, your worship bulletin. It could be a part of the prayers of the people. You could write that in there, and it could be said, at the beginning of announcements at church. So it could be put in writing, or it could be orally delivered. But then, and then what this does is, this is a very simple thing to do. Anybody can do it. It's not difficult. But what it does is it gets people to thinking, and it gets people to start talking about what happened. What happened? There were people here, and they're not anymore. What happened? Why? And what can we do in response? It continues to tell the story of the tribe, so that we're not forgotten. And that's so important. Our story needs to be told. So acknowledging it.
Yes, so we have been doing land acknowledgements at our public events. David just mentioned that. David Crosby just mentioned that. So I'm happy to send you the language that we use. I will say I didn't write it. There's a bunch of examples online, and so I just kind of put a couple together that seemed the most meaningful and appropriate for our church tradition. And I'm happy to send you that. Or if you're going to be at our special convention on Saturday, you will hear that. There's also an app that actually Brad Hauff shared with me like a year ago called Native Land. You know, it sort of, you go on there and it tells you what indigenous peoples or what tribes where you are standing on, or, you know, so you can move it around and go to different parts of the state or the states. So actually it's really kind of fun to look at it. Because there are tribes I may have never even heard of, and then I like Google them and learn about them and their traditions. So I really encourage you to look that up, even if you're not, even if you're a person who's not doing land acknowledgements because it's just for your own personal purposes. I really encourage you. It's an opportunity for learning, which is great. So I want to thank Brad for being here with us today. One of the things that Brad and I talked about is that he has been doing with other dioceses a book study on the Four Visions quest of Jesus, and so he can do that with us as well. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email. And I think it's, did you say 6 weeks?
Yeah, the Four Vision Quest of Jesus, a study group. I'm doing one right now with the Diocese of Texas. We have 12 or 13 people who are a part of that, I think. And we had our first session on Saturday, and it went really well. It'd be 9 sessions because there are 9 chapters in the book. And so we just go through it with a chapter at a time.
So I've just put in my email address in the chat. And then if there's at least a couple of people interested, we can get back to Brad and get on his schedule for that. So we'll be talking more, and there'll be more opportunities for learning related to our Indigenous peoples beyond the book study as well. So like I said, keep in touch. Thank you for being here. I forgot to say that Bishop Susan Goff sends her regrets and her greetings. She had an ordination today, or 3 ordinations today, which is really important and why she could not join us. So I'm going to close us in prayer. And then I'm going to read, I think I may have missed some of your messages, so I will read those through and just shoot you an email and answer your question. This is a prayer attributed to St. Francis, which you have heard plenty of times, but it's a good one, and we're going to end with this. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Have a blessed day, everyone. Thanks, Brad.